The chamber of the Galactic Council gleamed with polished metal and shimmering banners, a stage designed to project authority. Delegates of dozens of species gathered in tiers, their postures steeped in pride. Voices overlapped, sneers carried across the vast room, and all of them directed their ridicule toward one subject, Earth. The human envoy stood at the center platform, stone-faced, absorbing the storm of derision as alien speakers took turns condemning humanity as reckless primitives. One after another, they quoted statistics of wars, environmental destruction, and what they labeled an unrefined obsession with violence. Each statement was followed by a chorus of laughter or murmurs of approval, feeding the mood of smug superiority. A representative from a reptilian empire raised a claw and declared that humans lacked restraint and would inevitably bring instability wherever they spread. An aquatic species with gossamer fins rippled disdain through the chamber, describing humanity as short-lived vermin playing with tools they barely understand. The words were recorded by dozens of drones, their broadcasts instantly transmitted across countless systems. In real time, the galaxy was being instructed to regard Earth as little more than an infection to be quarantined. The human envoy requested the floor, but the motion was denied before it could even be voiced. Protocols were bent, procedures ignored, mockery overrode civility. As the debate swelled, the condemnation shifted from analysis to outright insult. Delegates told crude anecdotes about human barbarism, reciting old histories of genocide and nuclear annihilation as if those acts defined humanity's only legacy. They dismissed achievements in medicine, art, and exploration as irrelevant when compared to what they considered an inborn savagery. The council leader, a towering figure with translucent skin, slammed a gavel and proclaimed humanity a dangerous aberration. Sanctions were proposed, embargoes on trade, restrictions on star travel, and military oversight of Earth's orbital space. The vote was taken swiftly, hands, claws, and appendages raised with near unanimity. Only a few hesitant members abstained, fearing what such a declaration might provoke, but their silence was drowned by the overwhelming roar of approval. The human envoy remained motionless, eyes fixed forward as the chamber celebrated its own decision. In the galleries above, alien spectators jeered openly, waving banners and shouting slurs that echoed like a trial conducted for entertainment rather than justice. Not a single voice rose in defense of humanity's potential or rights. Not one reminder that Earth had been invited into the interstellar fold only decades earlier with promises of fairness. All of that was erased in a tide of contempt. The spectacle was designed to humiliate, to reduce Earth to a cautionary tale before billions of watching eyes. The envoy's face betrayed nothing, but the faint tightening of his jaw spoke louder than any rebuttal could have. As the session closed, the council leader delivered the final decree. Humanity was to be monitored, restrained, and placed under collective guardianship until it proved its worthiness. The words were delivered in a tone that dripped with superiority, as though the fate of an entire species could be dismissed with a casual wave. Delegates applauded themselves, congratulating one another for their wisdom, basking in the certainty that they had rendered Earth powerless. To them, the matter was concluded. To the humans present, it was a moment carved into memory with the sharpness of a blade. The envoy turned and walked away from the central dais without speaking, the weight of every insult carried silently in his steps. Alien eyes followed, some gleeful, others indifferent, none imagining that the silence masked anything more than resignation. In truth, that silence was the first warning, an unspoken acknowledgement that Earth had heard enough. The transmission of the session spread rapidly, streamed into homes and command centers across Earth, every sneer and insult archived in perfect clarity. Humanity's leaders, citizens, and soldiers watched together, and though their reactions varied from fury to sorrow, one common thread united them: none forgot. The Council intended to diminish Earth to a footnote, but instead, its words seeded a determination that no alien in that chamber could yet comprehend. When the envoy's transport departed the Council station, no applause followed, no parting words were offered, only the echo of mockery lingering in the vast chamber. The Council members congratulated themselves on their decisive action, convinced they had neutralized the threat with politics alone. Yet far from that shining assembly, on a world they regarded as crude and insignificant, the recordings of that day became something else entirely, a rallying cry. The council mistook silence for submission, and in doing so, they failed to recognize the lesson that history had repeated countless times on Earth, that mockery and oppression rarely break humanity. More often, they forge its resolve. The broadcast of the council's decree rippled across Earth like a shockwave, received on every device, screen, and relay. What was intended to humiliate instead fused billions together in shared outrage. Citizens who had once argued about borders or ideologies now found themselves united in anger, replaying every word of ridicule, every sneer that painted them as vermin. The insult struck deeper than policy or sanction. It targeted identity, dismissing an entire species as incapable of dignity. For ordinary people, that sting became fuel. For leaders, it was the spark to abandon hesitation. And for soldiers, it was permission to prepare for the inevitable. In quiet rooms where strategy had long been debated but rarely acted upon, the recordings became exhibits, proof that humanity's survival could not rest on diplomacy alone. Nations that once quarreled over resources and spheres of influence recognized the futility of division. Leaders who had never shared a table now convened in sealed chambers, their rivalries set aside in recognition of a threat larger than any single border. The Council's decree had been meant to contain Earth. Instead, it pushed humanity into its first true era of unity. From sprawling capitals to military outposts hidden in the cold of the Antarctic, networks hummed with the same conclusion: strength was now the only currency that mattered. Projects once considered too radical, too dangerous, or too costly were resurrected overnight. Laboratories hidden under mountains reignited reactors to test forbidden technologies. Engineers in orbital yards received orders to convert civilian freighters into war-ready carriers. Submarine bases long thought obsolete began constructing experimental weapons designed for space deployment. On the frontiers of science, theories shelved for ethical concerns were dusted off, scrutinized not with fear but determination. Artificial intelligence systems were unleashed to simulate war on scales no living tactician could match, training strategies at speeds impossible for organic minds. Swarms of drones were manufactured in silence, their numbers multiplying until factories once used for consumer electronics now pulsed with war footage assembly lines. Across Earth's militaries, drills took on a new intensity. Soldiers no longer trained for conflicts measured in trenches or deserts but for battles fought in vacuum, where silence was broken only by the impact of metal at hypervelocity. Recruits were told bluntly that hesitation meant extinction. Naval officers studied alien fleet maneuvers with cold detachment, not to admire them but to map weaknesses. Pilots rehearsed maneuvers that would have been suicidal in atmospheric combat but could devastate sluggish alien cruisers and used to such reckless precision. Every rank, from the greenest cadet to the most seasoned general, internalized the same doctrine: if humanity struck, it would strike harder than any enemy expected. The Council mistook Earth's silence for weakness, but that silence concealed networks of encrypted communications spanning every continent. It carried orders to stockpile reserves, convert industries, and prepare entire populations for endurance. Civilians were not excluded. In workshops and factories, ordinary men and women built components that would soon be loaded into launch bays. In universities, students once focused on theoretical physics now poured their knowledge into weapons guidance and shield-piercing algorithms. The insult had not just mobilized armies, it had mobilized an entire civilization. As preparations accelerated, a grim philosophy crystallized among Earth's leaders. Diplomacy had failed not because of poor negotiation but because contempt could not be reasoned with. The Council had revealed its true stance: humanity was never meant to be accepted, only managed. That realization hardened decision-making. The question was no longer whether to retaliate but how devastating that retaliation should be. Debates within command centers became less about morality and more about efficiency. How quickly could fleets be built? How many systems could be struck simultaneously? What targets would send the clearest message? These discussions were not framed in rage but in calculation, as though vengeance were an equation waiting to be solved. Yet beneath the precision and planning lay an undercurrent of emotion that no technology could quantify. The memory of ridicule lingered, and with it came an almost ancestral instinct, the refusal to kneel. Throughout history, attempts to subjugate humanity had forged revolutions, uprisings, and relentless wars of independence. That same instinct now stretched from one hemisphere to another, amplified by the certainty that extinction awaited if Earth hesitated. What billions felt individually merged into something collective, an iron will that no alien intelligence could measure on a chart. By the time the Council's broadcasts faded from alien news cycles, humanity had already begun shifting the balance. Fleets once hidden in construction docks rose into orbit under cover of night, their transponders dark. Satellites were reprogrammed into weaponized constellations. Kinetic launch systems were calibrated with chilling accuracy, each capable of turning mountains into ammunition hurled across interstellar space. The transformation was not dramatic but methodical, carried out without the spectacle of parades or announcements. Humanity's enemies saw only silence. What they did not see was the storm forming beneath it. When the final reports arrived in command bunkers, the conclusion was stark and undeniable. Humanity was ready not to defend but to retaliate. Not to plead for recognition but to carve it through force. What had begun as humiliation had become the foundation of a war doctrine more uncompromising than any alien strategist had ever imagined. The Council had given Earth its verdict, but Earth had written a reply in steel and fire long before the first alien fleet realized the depth of its mistake. The border patrols of the Council's fleets drifted with casual certainty, their commanders convinced that the sanctions had crippled humanity's will. Reports filtered back of unusual silence from Earth, but silence was interpreted as submission. That miscalculation ended the moment the first human strikes erupted. Without warning, orbital stations guarding trade lanes lit up in fire, their defenses bypassed before alarms could even cycle through. Precision payloads of kinetic projectiles, launched at near-relativistic speed, tore through armored platforms as if they were paper. Patrol cruisers, lumbering with ritual formations meant for intimidation rather than survival, shattered under volleys of drones that moved like swarms of metallic hornets. What the aliens witnessed was not the chaotic aggression they had accused humanity of, but a coldly engineered doctrine of devastation. Human fleets emerged not as scattered ships but as coordinated phantoms. They slipped past picket lines, bypassed outposts, and struck deep into systems the Council had considered untouchable. Colonies that had supplied the sanctions were reduced to silence as orbital bombardments left cities unrecognizable. The message was unmistakable. Retaliation would not nibble at the edges but strike the heart. Alien commanders accustomed to ceremonial warfare could not comprehend the relentlessness. Humanity fought as though no rules existed. Deception became weapon, feints lured fleets into ambushes where entire armadas vanished in minutes. Artificial intelligence directed squadrons adapted mid-battle, rewriting tactics faster than alien officers could issue commands. Every encounter ended with a single undeniable pattern: humanity never withdrew. Reports poured into the Council chamber describing annihilation at scales their historians had not recorded for centuries. Ships that survived described battles that felt less like wars and more like extermination campaigns. Crews spoke of weapons invisible until impact, of systems corrupted by viruses that turned navigation arrays into death spirals, of human strike craft willing to ram if munitions ran dry. There was no hesitation, no plea for quarter, no broadcasts of surrender. Where humanity appeared, resistance collapsed not because of superior numbers but because of sheer unpredictability and ruthless execution. For every alien fleet destroyed, whispers grew louder: the humans are not fighting for victory, they are fighting to erase threats. The Council's militaries had trained for engagements of endurance, fleets trading fire in measured duels that preserved balance. Humanity dismantled those traditions overnight. Instead of measured volleys, they unleashed storm barrages that overwhelmed shields before counterfire could organize. Instead of retreating when outnumbered, they struck at supply chains, severing fuel and communications so that massive fleets withered into drifting hulks. Planets that had voted to sanction Earth found themselves isolated, trade routes cut, economies collapsing not over decades but in weeks. The brutality was matched only by its efficiency. Every strike carried calculation, removed the ability to recover, forced the enemy into paralysis. Alien civilians who once cheered the Council's condemnation began whispering fears as stations went dark and convoys failed to arrive. Merchants reported that human raids left nothing salvageable, not even debris worth scavenging. Outposts where arrogance had once thrived now broadcast desperate pleas for help before vanishing into static. The psychological impact spread faster than the physical destruction. Species that had mocked humanity as crude now muttered in panic, wondering if the same ferocity would one day reach their homeworlds. What they had labeled barbarism now revealed itself as something far more terrifying: calculated ferocity, engineered not for intimidation but for finality. Within weeks, alien analysts admitted privately what their leaders refused to say publicly: humanity had overturned centuries of doctrine in a single campaign. Their fleets had not simply won battles, they had rewritten the meaning of war. Where the Council believed survival came from tradition, humanity demonstrated that survival came from adaptability and the refusal to accept limits. No civilization had prepared for opponents who treated conflict not as ritual but as necessity. Every encounter reinforced the same conclusion: humanity was not just fighting back, they were sending a declaration written in wreckage, that no insult, no sanction, no attempt at domination would go unanswered. The most chilling element of these strikes was not the destruction itself but the absence of emotion in their execution. Communications captured from human fleets were devoid of rage, their orders delivered with surgical precision. Targets were selected, strikes carried out, fleets moved on without gloating or delay. To the Council, this coldness revealed a truth more unsettling than any fiery speech could: humanity was not lashing out in anger, but enforcing a doctrine it had chosen long before. The silence that once seemed weakness was revealed as preparation, and the retaliation they now endured was not uncontrolled fury but deliberate policy. When the third wave of assaults ended, entire sectors lay in ruin, their defenders either annihilated or fleeing. Survivors who staggered back to the Council described humans not as soldiers but as executioners, relentless and unyielding. The very accusation once leveled in mockery, that humanity was too brutal to belong, had become the reality that now terrified the galaxy. For the first time in generations, the Council confronted an enemy it could neither intimidate nor outlast. Humanity had made its answer clear: Earth's place would not be begged for, it would be carved into history with fire and iron. Panic gripped the Council as reports of destruction poured in from every frontier. Delegates who had once spoken with arrogance now shouted over one another, their voices laced with fear. Entire fleets had been erased, colonies silenced, trade lines obliterated, and none of their countermeasures had slowed humanity's advance. The chamber that had echoed with laughter at Earth's expense now resounded with frantic arguments. Some demanded immediate negotiations, others urged mass mobilization, but beneath the noise one truth became unavoidable: humanity had become the most dangerous power in the galaxy, and the Council had brought it upon themselves. Documents detailing the scale of the losses were read aloud by trembling clerks. 3 systems gone dark in less than a month, orbital yards reduced to drifting slag, millions dead with no survivors to recount details beyond fragments of intercepted transmissions. Species that had considered themselves militarily unassailable now found their home sectors exposed, their fleets gutted. For centuries, wars had been limited in scope, managed carefully to preserve stability. Now that balance was gone. Humanity had ignored every restraint the Council had enforced for generations, and in doing so revealed how fragile those restraints truly were. It was not just the physical losses that shook the delegates, but the collapse of certainty itself. Behind closed doors, generals confessed to their leaders that the tactics used against Earth were obsolete. Their doctrines of slow attrition could not withstand swarms of autonomous craft or projectiles hurled at relativistic velocity. Defensive shields designed for ceremonial duels crumpled under the sheer brutality of saturation fire. Counter-hacking measures, once effective against minor espionage, failed completely against human code that adapted faster than firewalls could respond. Even their intelligence networks proved blind, unable to anticipate Earth's movements or predict where the next strike would fall. The Great Council, an institution that prided itself on order, was now reduced to reacting blindly, like prey trying to outrun a predator it could not see. Delegates who had mocked Earth most loudly found themselves isolated, their colonies targeted first in a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Whispers grew that humanity was making examples of them, punishing arrogance with annihilation. As the chamber erupted in blame, accusations were hurled across species lines, centuries-old grudges resurfacing in the heat of fear. Yet every argument collapsed under the weight of a simple fact: no one wanted to draw further attention from humanity. The same voices that had demanded sanctions now begged to sue for peace, but none could agree on who should approach Earth, for fear that the messenger would be perceived as weak and become the next target. Silence had become a survival tactic, and it paralyzed the chamber. What unnerved the Council most was humanity's refusal to engage in diplomacy. Not a single envoy had been sent, no message of justification delivered. The attacks spoke for themselves, each strike a verdict handed down without negotiation. This silence made the retaliation impossible to control. If humanity had demanded concessions, the Council could have bargained. If humanity had declared war, the Council could have mobilized under a banner of unity. Instead, the absence of words left every delegate guessing whether the campaign had limits at all. Some speculated humanity would stop after avenging its insult. Others feared the retaliation had no end but complete subjugation of those who had voted against them. The uncertainty was poison, eroding confidence faster than the destruction itself. When the first intercepted broadcast finally arrived, it was not a negotiation but an ultimatum. The message was short, stripped of rhetoric or flourish, transmitted on every frequency the Council used for governance. If you strike us again, none of you will survive. There was no demand for recognition, no plea for membership, no offer of compromise. The words were not shouted but delivered in calm precision, the tone of a species that had already demonstrated its will. The delegates sat frozen, unable to craft a response. Every alien present understood that the statement was not a bluff. The evidence of shattered fleets and burning colonies confirmed it more thoroughly than any speech could. The silence that followed the broadcast stretched through the chamber like a suffocating presence. Delegates who once sneered at humanity's ambition avoided even whispering the name. Fear reigned where pride had ruled. Records of that session would later describe it as the moment the Council realized the order of the galaxy had changed. Humanity had forced itself into prominence not by diplomacy but through terror, and the chamber that once mocked them now trembled at the thought of provoking them further. From that day forward, every decision would be weighed against the risk of drawing Earth's wrath, and the Council understood too late that the balance of power had shifted forever. The aftermath of the retaliation unfolded with a weight that could not be ignored. Alien empires that once dismissed Earth as insignificant now rebuilt in fear, their fleets scattered, their economies crippled, their sense of superiority shattered. Treaties once drafted to restrain humanity were rewritten to guarantee its place at the table, not as an equal but as a power no one dared cross. Systems that had voted most zealously for sanctions became the first to seek reconciliation, dispatching emissaries laden with offerings. The irony was bitter. The same Council that had humiliated Earth was now forced to legitimize it, not out of respect, but survival. Across the galaxy, the memory of devastation spread like legend. Merchants whispered about human fleets appearing without warning, striking with unrelenting precision before vanishing into the void. Refugees carried stories of colonies erased so swiftly that even distress calls were silenced mid-sentence. To ordinary civilians of distant worlds, the tales grew into myths that blurred fact with nightmare, yet the message remained clear. Earth had proven it could not be mocked, bound, or dismissed. The retaliation became a reference point, a turning line in galactic history, marking the end of an age of complacency, and the beginning of an era where every decision would be measured against the possibility of awakening humanity's wrath. For humanity itself, the victory was not celebrated with parades or triumphal monuments. The leaders who had guided the retaliation mourned privately, aware of the cost, even if alien casualties far outweighed their own. They did not revel in brutality, but neither did they apologize. To them, the retaliation had been necessary, an act of survival that transformed mockery into respect. Civilians, too, carried the weight differently. For many, the Council's insults had hardened into a permanent scar, a reminder that their species would never be granted dignity freely. They had learned that in the wider galaxy, respect was not gifted, it had to be seized. Generals and strategists analyzed the campaign not with pride but with calculation, recording lessons for future generations. They knew the retaliation was both a shield and a precedent. Should Earth ever falter, the galaxy would attempt to suppress it again, but the memory of retaliation ensured hesitation. Humanity's doctrine became codified in policy. No insult would go unanswered, no attempt at subjugation tolerated. The Council's chamber had once declared Earth unworthy, now it stood as a monument to the silence that followed humanity's ultimatum. The transformation was irreversible. Where once the galaxy had laughed at Earth, now it measured every step against the shadow of its fury. Among alien powers, fear shaped diplomacy in ways unseen for centuries. Former rivals approached one another cautiously, afraid to draw Earth's attention by provoking instability. Colonies at the edges of Council space petitioned for human trade, preferring risky alliances over the possibility of being ignored and left vulnerable. Even species untouched by the strikes altered their policies, adopting cautionary tones whenever humanity was mentioned. To them, Earth was no longer a participant in galactic politics but a force of nature, a variable no model could predict yet none could afford to dismiss. For the first time, the galaxy treated humanity not as a question mark but as an inevitability. Within Earth's leadership circles, debates turned to the future. The retaliation had secured survival, but survival alone was not enough. What role would humanity play now that fear had carved its place? Some argued for restraint, insisting that having proven their strength, Earth should step back and avoid becoming the very tyrants they had fought against. Others argued that the galaxy respected only power, and any sign of hesitation would be seen as weakness. Between these extremes lay a sobering consensus: humanity could never again afford to be underestimated. Whatever course they chose, they would walk it with the knowledge that the galaxy now watched them with the caution once reserved for legends. As years passed, the memory of the retaliation did not fade, it grew heavier. Children born in its wake were taught the story as both warning and inheritance. Soldiers repeated its lessons in training, engineers built weapons with its doctrine in mind, diplomats invoked its memory without needing to raise their voices. In every corner of Earth's society, the retaliation became more than an event, it became identity. It reminded them that dignity had been denied until they demanded it in fire, and that silence would never again be mistaken for surrender. The Council's chamber, once a theater of arrogance, became a place haunted by restraint. Delegates avoided open ridicule, their voices subdued when humanity's envoy entered. Where laughter had once filled the air, silence now followed. That silence was not respect in its purest form, but it was recognition, and recognition was all humanity required. The retaliation had not just reshaped the balance of power, it had forced the galaxy to acknowledge that Earth was permanent, indomitable, and unwilling to be erased. And in the quiet that followed, one truth settled over every star system: humanity had taught the galaxy that survival was not given, it was taken, and Earth would never again allow itself to be silenced.